You have your workbook in the chat, so go ahead if you have not had a chance. We'll be referring to that and using that throughout our session today. And it is happy hour, so welcome everyone. Making fiscal agent partnerships work. I was asked to do this because I might have an experience on everything that doesn't necessarily work. So with that, the title of this is that we are looking for that community collaboration, and it's sometimes harder than it sounds, and there's a lot of details that go into really having a fiscal agent partnership. And I happen to have an experience with going through several of them that I'm going to share in a moment. But the way we're going to cover this today is if you do have your workbook, we'll kind of look at that first page. We will first be talking about what I'm going to use what I call the TRIZ format. TRIZ is a great liberating structure that you can go ahead and look at. It's in your resources reference at the end of this handbook, but it's actually a way for you to take people through a journey of a reality check, so to speak. And so we're going to have a reality check of what really happens with coalitions related to these partnerships and doing a fiscal agent partnership. So the first thing is to look at it as what is the worst possible things that could happen? What are all the things that you should not do when you're talking about a fiscal agent partnership? Then we will say, okay, that's a great list, but you know what? There's probably some of these things that we probably actually are doing. So we're going to have some time to digest that and work through those things together in small breakout rooms. And then we'll come back together and just kind of take a look at what should we be doing? What are some of the considerations that we will be doing? And then to bring it home, we'll have you in some case studies just to kind of have a small group discussion about some of the things we covered, using your workbook as reference. And then we'll come back together, and at the very end, we'll go back to the references and then end up with looking at question and answers for those that want to stick around for question and answers. So that's how it's going to roll. All right, let's get this thing started. It's great to have so many folks here today. The first thing is talking about how fiscal relationships are based on these three things. And if you focus on nothing more than this, that having clarity, trust, and accountability are the foundation of having good fiscal relationships. So we're going to keep that in mind as we go through the activity that I'm going to describe here next. So the TRIZ, as I said, is a great tool. I use it a lot and have used it with groups. What it does is really look at things, kind of trying to figure out innovation in a non-conventional way, thinking about making space for those new ideas. It first asks, what must we stop doing in order to make progress or our purpose can come forward? And it's kind of fun because the original way of doing this is to think out of the box, and everything that may be absolutely unheard of, get it out on the table. So it doesn't have to be in truth, it can just be wild ideas. And so that's that creative destruction that lets us have those opportunities for renewal and new action. So that's why it works so well, because we kind of get crazy with our ideas, but then we come back and say, okay, there's a reality to this, and some of these things we actually may be doing. But we're going to start with that creative destruction with this fiscal agent. So kind of approaching this backwards. You came here to find out what makes a good fiscal agent. Well, we're going to start with what are the worst possible things we could do to ensure our fiscal partnership fails miserably. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time hearing my story. While I didn't fail miserably, I certainly learned some lessons. And so I'm going to share those lessons with you. For instance, it might be allowing the fiscal agent to use grant funds on staff for non-related duties. Someone may put that up as that should never happen kind of thing. And now it's like, well, the reality check is that we never had a fiscal agent that had a clear MOU, and the board didn't really understand what was going on. So therefore, the third part of this is to say, okay, if that's the actual thing, then we need to be able to develop a clear MOU and spend some time explaining the role in the organization, community, and funding expectations. So that's a framework that the TRIZ works on. And yeah, oh God, you guys I just saw the chat move on my right-hand side. Yeah, I got right down to business here. We're offering you to drop your coalition's name in the chat and a word that describes how your fiscal agent partnership feels right now. Because maybe this kind of sounds familiar. Maybe you don't have some of those structures in place. Maybe there's some things that that you need to be working towards. And so some of us are seeing this actually happening in their coalition. It's not uncommon. You're going to find that you have some friends in common here. And actually, if you go through that chat and you feel like that is your issue too, go ahead and give some love or emoji onto that chat. Find your friends there. So I'm going to give you, hey, Sandra, give you some time to look through this and just scroll through what people are putting there. So the coalition, and then also make sure you say what's a word that kind of describes, a word or words that describe your coalition right now. We've got non-existent, supportive but not super involved. What else? What are some other words? Go ahead and just put a word or words in there. In transition, the fiscal agent that has resigned. All right. Yes. And feel free to continue to make some friends there. And if you find someone that you, herding cats, if you find someone that is kind of like, that is me too, we need to, talk, because sometimes it's working through these things together. So find some friends that are also struggling with some of the same things that you are. But I'm going to start us off with just some of the lessons that I have learned along the way. So for those that don't know me, I did this work years ago. I was born and raised and lived and worked and raised my kids here in this county of Kossuth County, Iowa, center of Iowa, 15,000 people. We are the largest county in the state of Iowa, and by land mass, that is. But we are so far removed for so many things. And so back in the day, before my kids, who are all raised now, there was this grant that came out, and it was a DCAT grant. It was a real small grant from the Human Services Decategorization Grant. And there's 5 people that came together and said, we really need this in Kossuth County. It's exciting to me today to hear that these are coming back, but they founded their coalition around 40 developmental assets. And I was working in the car industry when that happened. The job was posted, and I realized the car industry wasn't really a great place for me to raise kids. So I applied for this job and I got it, but I had no idea what 40 developmental assets were. Well, there's this 5-person board, and on that 5-person board, one of the board members, in order to get this grant, they had to have a fiscal agent. And Mark, he worked for the area education agency, and it seemed like a great fit. So the area education agency was in a different county. Their home office is in a different county than what I was residing and where our work was supposed to be done. So it was expected that I would drive over to that fiscal agent county every single day, because this is long before our remote work or having remote offices. So I drive 45 minutes over to that office to drive 30 minutes back to our county to do the work, because most of our work, as you all know, coalition work, is in the field with the people, and you're knocking on doors, going to meetings. It wasn't over in that county at all. And it soon became apparent when that fiscal agent actually merged and made a bigger area, and their agency got moved to an hour away now, an hour further away. And it was like, this does not make sense to have this coalition work being done here in Kossuth County. And when it was supposed to be way down in Fort Dodge, she was checking in. So Scott, another board member, stepped up to the plate and said, let's switch fiscal agents. That's not the easiest thing to do when you have grants. They have a lot of concerns about, what's the problem here. We didn't have a lot of grants at that time. We were applying for the drug-free community support grant. I was a terrible grant writer. I wrote it with no objectives that should have been funded, and I didn't get funded. move forward, learned a lot. That's how you learn. Got my feedback on that grant. Scott stepped up, and the YMCA, our local YMCA, became our fiscal agent. And with that, it seems like a coalition working with youth and healthy living and all that seemed like a great fit, right? Well, it came along. We had been growing and succeeding and doing what we should be doing, and we were in the position to write a successful drug-free community support grant. What we didn't test out and wasn't really clear on was the responsibilities of carrying a $125,000 grant. The YMCA didn't have me or any of the staff in the budget. And so when we received the news of the drug-free community support grant and hired the folks, guess what? Funding didn't come in right away. Anyone ever have that happen? Yeah. So 6 months without funding. And luckily for myself, and I guess for those that I had working with me on this grant, we were building a house at the time. This is terrible, you guys. I don't even like to tell you this, but I funded the salaries out of our construction loan for 6 months. Why my husband stayed married to me, I don't know. But did that, and the money came through. I was trusting the money would come through. So know that your fiscal agent needs to be able to handle the funding, and there's a lot of hoops to jump nowadays. This is 20 some years ago. They really test you out with your fiscal stability and resources so that they know that you're going to be fiscally responsible with your grant. But if you're working with foundations or whatever, you want to make sure they can actually have the capability to handle the money and distribute the money the way it's supposed to be done by the funder. And so that's one thing. The other thing is when you have your fiscal agent, it's like a marriage contract, and they are not even a marriage contract. It is the fiscal agent is ultimately responsible and has control of how that money is being spent. So it was great under Scott, who was part of the original board members when he was the director of the YMCA. But guess what? Scott moved. Scott left, and in comes Jeff. And Jeff was not part of that original coalition grant. He had no clue what this was really about. He was a YMCA director. They really didn't have funding the way we were getting funding from all these different grant sources. They were funded by membership and marketing out those memberships. And so when he saw that the mentoring coordinator under another grant had the skills to really go out and recruit people, he said, why does she become our membership marketing person? Instead of being solely, she was one FTE, full-time equivalent for mentoring. Now she was also doing marketing and membership for the YMCA. And I was like, you can't do that. And he says, well, I can. Well, he could, because he was ultimately responsible for the funds that were coming in, good or bad. I would bring it to our board, which is a separate board, which is another issue. Under the YMCA, it became that I was part of the YMCA, and our coalition, because of Connections, was just kind of lost. It was kind of shadowed by the bigger umbrella of the YMCA. And I was often referred to as a coalition or as a YMCA employee, not as a coalition employee. So our boards started seeing that this is just not working out. And maybe it was the time for us to move on. And for our third fiscal change, we became our own 501c3, which is another session for a whole nother time, which has its whole nother layers of many lessons learned there. But I've had my journey through many different fiscal agent changes, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here with you today, to share with you what I did, maybe some lessons that I learned. So imagine the worst. Funding freeze. The reimbursements are delayed. It's a reality. And you can find this in your workbook. So the list is here on page 3. Mission drift. Again, sometimes your fiscal agent has ultimately the ownership of how those funds are going to be spent. So it may not align with your mission. Identity confusion. So that's where I was being overshadowed, called as a YMCA employee versus a Kossuth Connections employee. And we never stood out on our own until we became our own 501c3. That geographic disconnect, if the fiscal agent is far away, there's issues there. There might be, even the processing of paperwork and making sure the funds do come and go. There's things to consider there. Leadership turnover. Everything was great when we had Scott, that original board member, on place, but when we rolled and we went through 3 different directors during the time that we were at the YMCA, and every time we had new issues with that director, and the middle one was the worst because he thought he could use those funds for anything, buying stuff that shouldn't have been bought. It was awful. Made it through it. And then ultimately, unclear agreements. We really just kind of, had that, yeah, let's go here, let's do this. We didn't have a formal MOU. So going into it with an MOU, memorandum of understanding, is so important to make sure those things are clearly outlined. Some of these things that are on this list are identified and there. Ethical dilemmas. Yeah, that was my middle ground director that it was a hard thing, and I went as far as I could to correct it, but ultimately he had the purse strings and was controlling that. Just so you know, my ethical self got to have on the very last day of his last board meeting. It was his last day. He was leaving the next day, and I sat there and I said, I just got to let you know that this person didn't represent our funds right. So the whole YMCA board was let known as he departed. Things got better, but it still was where we were under an umbrella that needed to be, we needed to break free from. And then ultimately the board disengagement. When you have board disengagement, that was what kind of happened. It's like the YMCA has, it's okay, the YMCA has this under control, and the rest of the board members can just step back and let them do their thing. And so if they would have been more involved, they would have been able to be more supportive. They would have been helping me navigate some of those things if we would have had more board engagement. And then the financial risk, yeah, that was my first confession to you, that I put myself out in the line. The liability was there. We did get a new mentoring grant with the next YMCA director that came on, and we got a new mentoring person. Well, she also brought to the table, and I really appreciate this YMCA director for pointing this out. She had funds. She came from someone that, was prominent in the community. She really didn't need the work. She just wanted to do it because it was good work. One thing she did was she funded a lot of the YPAL program herself, and because she could and she wanted to. She wanted to, bring pies for February Pie Month. She wanted to do all that. Well, the director, he said, Bonnie, if we didn't have these grant funds, would that YPEL program still be having all this stuff that you're bringing to it? So while you can, it doesn't mean you should. And so when just because you can donate things doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, because that program will not be sustained if the grant funds go away. So she then got going on her circle of influence and started getting donations from Hy-Vee for the pies, or each month she did a different thing and somebody in the community donated it, because if it wasn't Bonnie supporting it, it needed to be sustainable. And so that was a good lesson learned. And then the exit disaster. So making sure that you have that, whether it be the director leaving or if it was one of the fiscal agent people that knew what was going on, like Scott leaving the YMCA in the very beginning. We needed to really make sure that that transition happened, that the board was more involved. So those are all kind of things that, yeah, it might have been that some of these or all of these kind of happened to me. So we're going to have you kind of take a time to think through some of these and get to know some of the folks here with us today by going into a breakout room. And all these things, it's one of those deals that funding freezes happen. People don't necessarily understand grants. It was all done with good intent, is what their knowledge base was, right? So we want to first start with that. So we want to talk about maybe one time that you've had a worst case scenario moment yourselves. So you're going to be in a breakout room with a few other folks. and what caused it? What could have prevented it? Talk through some of those things. And we're back. Welcome back, everyone. So hopefully you got to meet some folks that had some similar stories. I like to see the smiles on people's faces. Obviously, we identified and connected somewhere along the way. Gonna unpack that, just asking for a summary in your room as I was telling folks that were back early. Gonna look for just whatever you talked about. It might have been that you just got to know each other. But if you did share a worst case scenario or moment that you witnessed, go ahead and share that with us, what you talked about in your room, what might have prevented it. And we welcome you to use the annotate as one option. You can use the chat if you want to also kind of share your scenarios. I think by letting us all know that you too probably had something similar, it makes us feel okay. It makes it like, okay, I'm not the only one dealing with this. So feel free to populate the chat and or the annotate if you're comfortable doing that, either one. But with words, group one, with Amy, Jacqueline, Kristen, and Michelle, what did y'all talk about in your room? Just real briefly. Can I get a volunteer from you?
I could talk.
Thank
I
you.
think we just shared, well, two of us in there are fairly new, so they have, lucky for them, they haven't experienced any fiscal agents or MOU problems, but I think a couple of us were able to share and just the importance of like the coalition board and the fiscal agent having an MOU, like written communication on the responsibility of the fiscal agent um, amongst themselves, whereas in some cases there's maybe an MOU for the mobilizer or the coordinator, but not necessarily the board and the fiscal agent expressing expectations in written form. So we talked a lot about that. Just open communication and having that written down solves a lot of problems.
And it's the little details that you didn't think of that, that's why I think it's great that you're all together and hopefully you meet some folks and maybe you pop up with an idea that I never thought about that as being an issue. So thanks for kicking us off. Deanne, Jennifer, and Ricky in room two.
Oh, I can report. So I've been in prevention long enough that I could relate to all of your stories, and it is kind of confirming to go, oh, other people have these issues as well. I don't really. I'm not a part of a coalition anymore. We support coalitions all across Kansas, and so if I haven't experienced it firsthand, I've worked with a coalition who has experienced it, and that's part of our reason to be here is how can we help to prevent some of these things from happening in the forefront with our coalitions that we serve. What could we put into an MOU to help bring clarity? All of these things, clarity, trust, and accountability, I think are really things that I deal with all the time with coalitions and their fiscal agents. Working with a scenario right now where there is a coalition that's been long-standing. They have their own 501c3, which you mentioned briefly brings on its whole new set of situations and issues. And they used to have a lot of grants and they had an executive director and a part-time staff. They now have one grant and a part-time mobilizer who is resigning, and with all of the change the board has decided, I think we don't want to do this anymore. I think we just want to close up shop. We don't have enough happening in order to keep our 501c3 and all that it entails, and so we're dealing with that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Kazoo Connections, the 501c3, a whole nother thing on sustainability, but they thought they could sell a cow to keep our salaries going. And no. So that's a whole nother time, another session. But it's important, the 501c3 still exists. They run a miniature golf course in our town. So it was one thing that the community got behind, but the work that the coalition was doing, they couldn't find it in the community to get behind that. So yeah, so we still exist and I'm still listed on the board but I don't do anything with it. So that's the other thing. You have to maintain a board with a 501c3. So that's why it's not just as easy as shutting your door.
Yeah, and this one happened to be that instead of having a coalition that is open that they're continuing to build support around, their board was their coalition that had the sectors involved, but they don't have a coalition to go back on then. They just have this board with a lot of great partnerships that while it was moving forward, it was working, but sustainability in this situation, it's not working.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, there's so much for us to learn from others that have walked the walk and maybe stepped in some mud somewhere along the way. Room 3, Michelle and Xandra. What'd you chat about? Xandra and Michelle Castile.
I got it. So we talked about some challenges in the structure of our coalitions and finding fiscal agents. The bylaws also were something that was difficult to navigate. And then what else we discussed? Being separate from public health and what that means, and also being under public health and what that means. So it was a great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. We got James and Lindsay in room 4 next. James or Lindsay?
So essentially, we talked about different kind of struggles within the VA and a little bit of the tricks to the system before we were cut off. But my me specifically, I'm not in a coalition per se, but I go and I support coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one that I attend that is struggling to keep and maintain staff. And so they're worried that they're going to have to end their coalition after February.
Yeah. There's uncertain times that we're in where we don't know where funding is. We see staff bailing a lot. And you still are responsible for the funds that come in. And so boards get put into carrying a heavy load because they ultimately are the ones of the fiscal agent responsible for that. James, you want to add anything?
Yeah, sorry, I stepped away right when I got called on. I heard my name right when I came back.
Hello.
No, yeah, that was great. Like attendance is kind of one of those worst case scenarios if people stop showing up and not a lot of engagement, kind of relying on one person to do a ton of work. That gets really challenging when that main driver of the force starts getting sidebarred from other job duties, and they can't put all 100% into a coalition. It kind of starts to fall apart there.
Yep. And I just want to put it in all your guys' thinking is that you all are conveners of a coalition. If you're hired as the director, you should really be called a convener because if you're really working with that board or those sectors around the table, it's their job to really keep the work moving forward. And your job is just to keep things moving together. So I think it should be coalition convener, not director, in my own personal opinion, because it shouldn't all land on your shoulders. Otherwise, the coalition would not go forward. So keep that in mind that you are the convener. And the other thing I want to say, I've been in coalitions that are from our state capital, so in Des Moines, to our little tiny towns. And sometimes our tiny towns have more people coming around the table than the big, huge cities. I always say whoever shows up at the table are the right people. And it might be only 5 people despite your size of your city. And those are the right 5 people that should be there. So know that what's the old saying go that, a few people can do great work. It is true with coalition work too, because you all have an influence. All right, room 5, Jessica, Jonah, Nicolette.
Hi, I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. So we kind of just talked about the importance of an MOU, and something I had experienced was spreading out our prevention managers across multiple grants. So that way, if we lose funding of one, it's not like, oh, well, you were the grant manager of that one, gotta kick it. Because that's just isn't fair. We wanna keep our team. So spreading it out and then also having some money that isn't federally funded. So that way we can have like 5 to 10% of our time where doing maybe other things like marketing for programs that maybe don't fall directly in that line of work, but we're able to.
Yes, very smart. Diversification is so important of people and funds. Room 6, Angelina, Callie, and Kimberlyn.
I can talk.
Thanks.
So I'm new to my position. I started back in May, and so I'm really trying to get in with coalitions and stuff. So that's one thing I talked about. And then one thing I've noticed with in the short time I've been working with my coalitions is they're overworked a lot. One of my CBOs is taking on the majority of the work for the coalition that they're in, and they just lost their director. So now their staff members are taking on their role, the director's roles, and running the coalition as well. So they're really overworked. And then in that as well, the community is, I don't say necessarily, it's not resistant, but they're also not quite ready to have the change that needs to happen for the community to grow. So involvement isn't the best. So
Sure. That reminds me, one of the grants that we had CIAs. Deanna, you remember having CIAs, Certificate of Involvement Agreement, I think is what it stood for. So everyone around the coalition got to sign a CIA of what they agreed to be involved in, which put a lot of pressure off of those people sitting around the table so that they weren't necessarily thinking they're going to have to carry all this work. And when things starting to get piled on, you had to go back to that CIA and say, yeah, you didn't sign up for this. So help us find someone that can help fill those shoes that we're missing. All right. Thanks. And we got 2 more rooms. We got Jordan, Sarah, and Shayla.
I can talk. Is my can you hear me okay? Sometimes my
Perfect.
speaker will auto select the wrong one.
You're perfect.
So we talked about how my fiscal agent I really, really love. I've been with them for 11 years. And so I see what a really, really amazing fiscal agent looks like. And so it makes me the coalitions that I work with, my colleagues in other counties across my state. I heard of one situation where a coalition was in their health department and they got a new supervisor in that section and said that the coalition coordinator has to work in person from 8 to noon, take lunch from noon to 1, and work from 1 to 5, and they weren't allowed to take any meetings outside that building, and they also weren't allowed to work after 5 o'clock. And so just
Didn't
like
know what coalitions were.
yeah, and it was really frustrating. And then there's another part of my state, some coalition quarters I know, who are considered a contractor of the fiscal agent. And so they have no access to the funds at all until they submit an invoice, which means all of the upfront costs are on them. And if there is a delay in getting reimbursed that can go on for months, like if our state legislature goes into a extended session and funding isn't like secured, in my state the funding comes from healthcare authority, and healthcare authority will send a letter that says intent to contract, and sometimes it's still not good enough for them to feel like the money is coming. We just like the state hasn't moved like to the next step yet. And so I've had friends who are coalition coordinators in other counties not get paid or reimbursed for 4 to 5 months.
Yeah.
which changes who is able to take on those jobs,
Mhm.
which is usually wealthier wives of doctors and things like that who don't need to be reimbursed for 4 to 5 months. And it's not really representative of the community.
Right, right. And it also makes your funding all kind of get bunched up because you're not spending any, and then all of a sudden you're having to spend a whole bunch at a time when it does come in, and so that's not best either. So yeah. Thanks for sharing, Sarah. All right, roommate. Aisha, Courtney, Deborah, and Jennifer.
All right, I can speak. And then feel free to chime in anyone at any time. First of all, most of us are TA providers in our group. And so we talked about some worst case scenarios. I mentioned a situation where I had a coalition with leadership who did not stay in their lane and promised a new coalition that they were helping to support. They were helping to support some things that they probably should not have done. And so it was a question of the wrong person making comments and over delivering and over promising and under delivering. And so it got to be really ugly there. And we also talked about how when some funding sources or funding sources can become fiduciaries for coalitions, especially when dealing with government, how that things can change. And so I'm thinking of a situation where a coalition had been taken or had been supported, was becoming supported by local government, and then they were not allowed to do a lot of things that they were once doing and hurting the community like on the back end.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, that fiscal person has all the say of what can and cannot be done, and ultimately because they're legally bound to the funds coming in. So yeah, great example.
precisely, yes.
Yep. All right. So that's step one of the TRIZ, is to get it all out there, because these are all awful things that really do happen, and many of you experienced those. So we're going to go to the next slide, which is going to launch a poll saying which of these cracks might already exist. So we know that what we've talked about is out there. And so Tess, can you run the poll? True or false is all we want you to say. If these things are related to, and a lot of you work with several coalitions, just in general then, is it true or false as far as this list of things that might go wrong with a fiscal agent? We might see those small delays or months delays, as Sarah was pointing out. We might see that someone else is being out there doing the work and of something other than the actual grant expectations. So I'm seeing a lot of people getting those MOUs. That's good. But you're also seeing some folks that can see where we have some room for improvement, right? And that's what the TRIZ is about. It's saying, okay, and we now identify that some of these areas we should go back and probably give TA on, or we should go to our coalition and tighten up the belt a little bit and making sure these things are happening. So we've got about half of you in, so keep on answering the questions. And if you're brand new to this, think even about a partnership that you were a part of, at some point along your way. Did you notice any of these things in place? A few more to get in, and then we'll take a look at what we got. If you have the poll, let's have, we've got a couple more finishing up here. We'll get one more at least in here. Give me another 10 seconds here to finish it up. And the last chance to get in. Tess, you want to show us the poll? All right, everyone seeing the poll? So reimbursements are timely and predictable, especially nowadays, right? Oh gosh, you all survived. You're still here today. You made it through one of the biggest craziness times of grant history, I'm sure. So you got to predict. And Sarah, was it you that said, you're diversifying your funding? Now's the time to go out and find those foundations and private donations. And really, it tells us we need to diversify. Everyone understands who approves expenditures and why. This, Courtney, you brought it up, I think, where a misunderstanding of what a coalition can and cannot buy. I had a fellow coalition member next county over who worked in a school. Her fiscal agent was a school, and they had separate funds, right? The coalition money did not come into the school. They were just the fiscal agent. He came in and scrutinized the chair that she was sitting on. It was nicer than his, and he said that she couldn't have that chair. And it's like, yeah, I can. And so, it's like you have to have some of those agreements of what can be spent and how they have say or not say. Our fiscal agent can clearly explain our coalition's mission. And yeah, that's where, I ran into with those YMCA directors. They really didn't know what we're about. So that might be something you can tighten up as well. We have a current signed MOU. Look at that. We're getting some good things going there. We meet regularly to review the finances and program updates. And that should be done regularly. And if you don't understand it, have someone else on your board that does to be able to explain it. If leadership changed, our systems would still function smoothly. And so you always should think that, it may change. So what are we going to do? What's our plan? What's our succession plan? How would that impact? What might be some good things that we could do? Who else would we want to look at? Our coalition board actively reviews the fiscal reports. 50-50 on that. And that's kind of hard because sometimes the reports delay, right? And so you don't always get the most current information. And then we've noticed a few gray areas or assumptions that need to be addressed. Yep, for sure. All right. Any questions on that before we move into our next activity? We'll come back to questions too at the end. So, all right. So the TRIZ, it gives us that insight. We name our intention and then we put it into implementation. So this is where you say, okay, what should we be doing? If these are the things that, yep, according to the poll, we actually are probably doing some of these things. What should we be doing instead? And this awareness allows you to do things better. It's, what was the old saying, if you know something's wrong, do better. That's kind of where we're at with this. So what does it take to have that good partnership is where we're going to look at again. So having those roles clearly outlined early, choosing the mission assigned partner, making sure that you're in alignment. I had that with the ones that we had as fiscal agent, but there's other things that came into play that we weren't so there, like verifying financial capacity. It seemed like a great fit with the YMCA, but we didn't verify that they had the capacity to carry the grant. Defining communication channels. How are we going to communicate? What are those things? And some of you folks talked about that as one of those issues that you had in the very first as we did our check-in. Ensure the board oversight, making sure that the coalition board is engaged, keep them informed. Another confession. So when I was doing this in the very beginning with our board, on my first evaluation as a coalition director, of a scale of 1 to 100, I got a 30 on my evaluation for my board. I was doing all the work. They had no idea what was going on. I didn't communicate. I owned that. It was my hard lesson learned that the board needs to hear it from us because they don't do the work. They're there on an occasion. So it's our job to really make sure that we're giving the board what they need. And then plan for that change. Change will happen. Get that exit clause in there, make sure it's there and maintain that transparency, making sure that those reports are out there, put them available onto the internet. Everything we do should be with public record for the most part. respect the boundaries, and that's where we make sure that we are doing what the grants say and we're staying within those things that we are funded to do. I knew someone that was assigned to be the front desk greeter and was assigned to clean the closets for the agency that she is working in. And I said, is that really in your job duties? Is that what the grantor is buying? Build trust gradually. So really making sure that you are there. Trust isn't something that comes right away. Trust is built by doing all these things. And then evaluate annually. How are we doing? What are some things that's working? What's not? Let's be real. What changes need to be happening? All right. All that is on the next page of page 4 in your handout. And we're going to use that to go into our next activity, where we're just going to kind of digest all these things in 3 case studies. So you're going to be put in one of these 3 case studies, which can be found on the following pages of your workbook. So the first one is Cedar Valley Prevention Partnership. So you might be put in a room of Cedar Valley. You'll be in 3 Cedar Valleys, and we'll have 3 people working on the next one, which is Horizon County Youth. And they'll have a third group working on Clear Path Coalition. So there's a short scenario, kind of help you start your conversation. Use it kind of just a talking point, reviewing some of these points of what's going right, where could they've done better. It might be, it might veer off into your own conversation, and that's okay. And as far as timing goes here, I think we get about 5 minutes is all in there. So just kind of a little bit of time to really go into those scenarios. And when we come back, we'll unpack some of those things that you discovered. In those breakout rooms, we want you to talk about, and Tess will put these in the chat right now, what was working well with that fiscal partnership, what might seem unclear or risky, and then what's one action that might strengthen the relationship within the case scenario. Tell us about Clear Path. What was Clear Path's Coalition? And then, because no one's read the scenario. So give us that first to kind of highlight overview.
Yep.
And then what was working well, what was unclear, and one way that they could strengthen.
Faye and I were in the breakout together. And so Clear Path, we're working together for 6 years under an umbrella of a regional health department. They required for a separate, they had to separate for financial management. They started their own 501c3, and they have been keeping very good communication and trust with their former fiscal agent. So that we felt that have been doing well, and there wasn't anything that we felt was unclear or risky. So they, unless we read it wrong or I read it wrong to Faye, she wasn't able to bring it up to read at that point, that all is going well for Clear Path.
All right. And what were some of the things that really felt like it was ready, that set themselves up for success? And I don't need to put you, Deb, on the spot, but anyone else that had Clear Path, you want to say?
I was just going to say that Deb and I both agreed they had a plan, a written plan, and they followed the plan, and they met monthly, and they tracked the progress of that plan and stuff. So the close communication and the plan, I think, were key.
Yeah, having that plan written out, having it to go back and refer to, using it as a measurement of how we're coming along, what are some things that are still missing, that's all very important. Yes, indeed. Anyone else from ClearPath want to add anything that you talked about?
We did talk about in our group, just to make it even strengthening the relationship, was there's a process in place for approval, but having the approved documents, whether that's logic model and action plans or whatever, to help guide the decisions and making sure everybody's on the same page, that would be helpful. The grant agreement, contract, any of that paperwork would be good.
Yes, indeed. All right. Let's go on to, go backwards here. Horizon County, what was your scenario? Someone from that group. You had Horizon County that you looked at. Who was in Horizon County, the second one?
I can go ahead and speak for us.
Okay, tell us about it.
Yeah, Horizon County is a youth alliance, and they had passionate volunteers that were eager to start up a coalition and use some federal prevention funds. And so they partnered with a local nonprofit as a fiscal agent without any formal agreement. And then they started noticing that there was some lagging in reimbursements, and the fiscal agent, or I'm sorry, the fiscal office changed personnel, and then communication started to break down. So coalition staff began covering their own the expenses of the coalition personally to keep programs moving. And then, which obviously is a problem. They then recognized that there was eventually a problem, and that they paused spending and then worked with a prevention consultant to draft their MOU so they could clarify how to approve expenses, how reimbursements would be processed, what oversight the coalition retained, etc. So yeah, I mean, clearly there was some breakdown similar to what we've talked about previously in the fact that there was no MOU in place, no formal agreement, no contract, which then caused some serious concerns, especially as fiscal personnel turned over. And then there wasn't those original personnel in place that made that original agreement. So, so good thing that they decided they needed to stop and create that MOU.
Never too late, right? The bottom line there to create the paperwork that you need to have in place. And anyone that knows me, I'm probably the worst at doing all that paperwork stuff. And so that was one of probably why we had so many issues. And it's just, owning that we need to have that. And if it's not your thing, it's okay, because there's someone that is there that knows that. In this case, it's a consultant that can help you and identify where those are. I mean, we've got several of those consultants that cover the state on place. All those that are those state consultants, is that something you would help a coalition do, get those MOUs? A couple of you that are there, is that within the
Yeah,
realm?
I happen to also be a consultant for the state of Ohio, and I'm currently in the midst of creating an MOU for a coalition that this exact thing happened to. So
There you go.
there you go.
So know that there's resources within your state that will help you craft these things. You don't have to do it all as a coalition director. There's definitely resources that are available. I will also point out that it's kind of timely. We could not cover everything in this, 1 hour, 90-minute webinar. That's just not possible. The PTDC at the national level is actually rolling out a longer, deeper dive into this coming into the spring, summertime, somewhere in there. So look for that. If this is something you want to go deeper with, and it's an area that you need to work with, there's more to come from it. So as far as on the TA note, let's not leave out our first one, which was Cedar Valley. Who was in the Cedar Valley group and want to talk to us what we had there? James.
Yeah, I'll kick us off. I think what was working well with this partnership is they kind of anticipated problems and attempted to put like procedures and MOUs into place, and try and lock down some of their financial struggles. There was some unclear and risky things with that. So I don't know if anybody else in the group wants to speak of it, but it seemed like the MOU was only made up by two people, two directors, two of them, instead of a board being involved or anything else. So it looked like that was just between those two. So if one of those left, the MOU might not apply to the new person. So there was kind of that issue. And as one action that will strengthen the relationship, I think I'm gonna let one of my other partners help out with that one.
Let's see, one action that will strengthen the relationship, probably involving more of their board members with the MOU draft, just so it's a little bit more sustainable. So it just seems like there was no discussion, and obviously things will change, people change. So.
And it should be an MOU that you could pick up and go to the next fiscal agent if that needs to be. So, I mean, it should, once you get it down of what works for your coalition, it's kind of the framework of what works for your coalition. And then you're kind of interviewing and hiring your next fiscal agent if you have to do that. And I say that with a big if. Boy, if you can land with a fiscal agent and keep that partnership, that would be my number one suggestion. But life happens and that doesn't always work that way. So you need to make sure it's got everything in it that you really want. So excellent. And all this led to is that we really need to have those strong MOUs. If there's one thing to take away from this today, is really about having those MOUs, and they should be a living document, not a paperwork that's just filed away. You should review them. You should make sure they're still serving you. In your packet, if we're continue on, there's a checklist of all those things to consider of a fiscal agent selection, sample MOU elements, board oversight. So that's there. There are the references that we have that we noted and pulled from. And the very last one, if you enjoyed this process of the liberating structure and you want to know how to do it and facilitate such a thing, there's the website for that to pull that up and the instructions are there. The final thing that's in your packet is that MOU. This is an example, one example, that shows the purpose and the background of why we have it. What are the roles and responsibilities? Who needs to be in there? Looking at what each is going to do on both ends of the side. What is the financial management? Making sure that they follow the codes that are needed by grants. The communication and reporting, what's that going to look like? How is that going to play out? And then what is the term? This isn't forever. This is for a term limit. So you want to make sure it has a term. And then everyone signs it and you have disclaimers. So as you take a moment, just everyone have this packet or on a screen somewhere, or in general, if you think about with an MOU, what are some things that you know need to be in place or you have experience with an MOU? Let's just hear or put in the chat a couple things that clearly defined the party roles. What are some things that were helpful seeing today or something that you've experienced in defining party roles? What do we want to make sure we include in there? Expectations. What else? James?
Financial obligations,
Financial obligations.
time commitment,
Mhm.
staffing time commitment.
Yep. How often the budget is reviewed. The reimbursement process. The communication and clarity are important. Like the meeting to review the budget and approve the expenses. Yes. How do you make sure that you have transparency and communication happening? What are some things that would be important to help transparency and communication? Having a website. Anyone have a website? Posting on a website? Your minutes, your financials, inviting anyone to see the books, having clear expectations and responsibilities. Yep. What might be some things that you have put in an MOU that you may not have thought of that seemed a little unique that you felt was helpful? Anyone have something that you felt, I wouldn't have thought of that. I'm glad we put that in our MOU. Those that have some experience. one thing that comes to mind is that even that succession planning, right? Should a member need to leave, they need to tell the whole board how many weeks or months ahead of time, how to fill that position, what are kind of things that are going to be in place. All those kind of things might be important to have in this MOU. What else? Would that be in the bylaws for the coalition? Yeah, there's a difference between bylaws and MOU, and this is with that's true. But I will say, Amy, you're right. That's more of a bylaw thing because the memorandum of understanding really is that living, breathing thing for the fiscal agent. So I'm thinking more so like as the board of directors heard that Scott, the original board director for the YMCA, was leaving, what kind of transition does the board have with that fiscal agent? So MOU for this purpose is really just that fiscal agent who creates the budget each year. What kind of reports are needed for the fiscal agent's board? Because I had my own board with the coalition, and I also needed to report to, because the YMCA board had no clue about the grants or even how that reimbursement piece went. And so they always were really confused. So making sure that there's a communication between their finance board and our coalition board was important as well. So what does that look like? Boy, that kind of just triggered a real bad memory of a bad meeting. Where I'm like, you guys just don't understand. This is the way it works. So yeah. All right. So coming to the end of our top of our hour, I just would like to have you either in the chat as our checkout, put in the chat one thing that you were brought to light about today that you didn't know when you were coming in. So what's the one thing you're going to take away? And I'll welcome a few voices as the chat gets populated. What are some things that you remembered or were new to you? And I won't make people come into the mic area, but I'd welcome a few voices if someone would be willing to share. Do I need to call on you? No.
I can share really quickly.
Sure.
So I do support more on the TA side for between coalitions and also working with the fiduciary. I have not had a ton of experience with developing those MOUs between the fiscal agent and the coalition. However, it's like eye-opening that I can't believe I haven't considered this a lot more, because we talk a lot about those coalition bylaws and sharing the bylaws and things like that. But really developing that MOU between those two agencies seems crucial, as we're always talking about best practices and developing those communication streams and those standard meetings that really preemptively, if you have those that MOU understanding, you're avoiding so many issues that you're need to go on the back end to correct. So I can't even believe that I haven't really put more focus on that personally and had that understanding before today. So thank you so much for doing that for me.
Absolutely. And I think hopefully you enjoyed the journey through the liberating structure, because I think that's a great way to, think of the worst case scenario thing. Well, that's what you want to make sure that you address, because you don't, like you said, you don't want those things to happen. So those worst case scenarios, whatever they may be, should be addressed in that MOU. And so we kind of worked backwards to get to what would be best to be included. And so keep that in mind with that. Let's hear from two more voices. What's something that was an aha or you're taken away? No voices? It's lunchtime here. Let's get us free for lunch here in Central Time anyway. Just one more voice. What's something that you took away from your group or appreciated about what was shared? Not necessarily even by me. Maybe you had some conversation in your small group.
I think it's just interesting that most of us have had some type of fiscal agent coalition problem that
Yeah.
maybe been avoided with a better MOU or better agreement. But I think just talking clear across different states, most of us at some point have been like, yeah, I had that as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah. And I think, thank you for speaking up. I think it's validating that, you can't think of everything. And that's why you have those TA providers out there. That's why you have resources like this. And again, this wasn't to be everything, but it was for you to start thinking of what you needed to be in place. Know that there's additional resources, more coming on that, and know that you got folks out there that are going to help you. Reach out to your PTTC, reach out to your TA providers. They're there for you to get that help. And you and with one another. Hopefully you met a friend here today that you might be able to reach out to and say, hey, I want to test this out. What am I missing? And that's oftentimes the best way to look at things. What are we missing? And so think of the worst case scenario, work your way into what you should do. And with that, we're going to close. And Tess, you want to say what else? And we'll stick around for question and answers or a little time of just open mic.
Yeah, we're open for the next 30 minutes for anyone who wants to dive into this topic a little bit more. You can feel free to post in the chat, go off mute, whatever you want. Thank you everyone for attending for the 90-minute session today. And thank you, Angie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to stop recording.